the decision that put Venezuela on the map. Let me take you back to March 5, 2024, just another Tuesday in the slow-motion collapse of the American-led world order. That was the day the U.S. Treasury Department, in a quiet press release buried beneath the noise of a presidential election cycle, announced it was reimposing sanctions on Venezuela's oil and gas sector. The official reason? A technical violation of the 2023 Barbados Agreement, where Nicolas Maduro's government had promised, but failed to fully deliver, free and fair elections. The media dutifully reported it as a routine enforcement action, a necessary but unremarkable step in Washington's long-standing pressure campaign against Caracas. The New York Times ran a 600-word piece quoting a State Department official who called it a measured response to democratic backsliding. The Wall Street Journal framed it as a win for human rights advocates. Even the Venezuelan opposition, long divided between those who want to negotiate with Maduro and those who want to overthrow him, issued a tepid statement calling the move a step in the right direction. But here's the I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of energy geopolitics, great power competition, and the slow unraveling of U.S. hegemony in Latin America. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that this wasn't just another sanctions tweak. This was the moment Venezuela stopped being a peripheral crisis and became the front line of a new Cold War. The moment Washington, whether it realizes it or not, handed Moscow and Beijing a golden opportunity to reshape the Western Hemisphere's balance of power. And if you're not paying attention to what's happening in Caracas right now, you're missing the most consequential geopolitical shift of the decade. Now, let me be, I'm not saying this because I have some ideological sympathy for Maduro. Far from it. I've written extensively about the humanitarian catastrophe his regime has overseen, the corruption that has hollowed out Venezuela's once prosperous economy, and the cynical way his government has weaponized migration to destabilize neighboring countries. But geopolitics isn't about morality, it's about power. And the power dynamics at play here are far more dangerous than the official narrative suggests. So let's start with what they want you to believe. The story goes like Venezuela is a failed state, a cautionary tale of socialist mismanagement, and the United States has a moral and strategic obligation to pressure Maduro into holding free elections. The sanctions, we're told, are a precision tool, targeted, reversible, designed to squeeze the regime's finances without punishing the Venezuelan people. The 2023 Barbados Agreement was supposed to be Maduro would allow opposition candidates to run in good faith, and in return, the U.S. would ease sanctions, allowing Venezuela to sell more oil on global markets. When Maduro reneged, blocking opposition leader Maria Corina Machado from running, arresting activists, and manipulating the electoral process, the Biden administration had no choice but to snap back the sanctions. It's a clean, logical story. The kind of thing you'd read in a State Department fact sheet. But there's a problem with this narrative. Actually, there are several. First, the sanctions were never just about democracy. If they were, we'd have seen a much more aggressive push to support the opposition in 2019, when Juan Guaidó was recognized by over 50 countries as Venezuela's legitimate interim president. Instead, what we got was a half-hearted effort, some sanctions, some frozen assets, a lot of rhetoric, and then, nothing. Guaidó's parallel government collapsed, his support evaporated, and Maduro not only survived but consolidated power. Why? Because the U.S. never had a coherent strategy beyond Maduro must go. And here's the dirty little: the sanctions regime was always as much about keeping Venezuelan oil off the market as it was about regime change. You don't have to take my word for it, just look at the numbers. In 2018, before the U.S. imposed its harshest sanctions, Venezuela was producing about 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. By 2020, that number had plummeted to 500,000. And who benefited from that supply shock? Saudi Arabia, Russia, and, ironically, the U.S. shale industry, which saw prices rise just enough to make fracking profitable again. The sanctions weren't just punishing Maduro, they were propping up American energy dominance. Second, the idea that the U.S. can turn the sanctions on and off like a faucet is a fantasy. The 2023 easing wasn't some magnanimous gesture, it was a desperate move to lower gas prices ahead of the 2024 election. Biden's approval ratings were in the toilet, inflation was still a political liability, and the administration needed Venezuelan oil back on the market to offset the loss of Russian supply after the Ukraine invasion. So they cut a Maduro would get sanctions relief, and in return, he'd stop flooding the US with migrants. It was transactional, cynical, and most importantly, temporary. The moment Maduro failed to deliver on the elections, the US snapped the sanctions back. But here's the thing about their sticky. Once you impose them, they create new realities. Markets adapt. Supply chains reroute. And other players step in to fill the void. Which brings me to the third, and most dangerous, flaw in the idea that Venezuela is still America's to control. That's where the story gets really interesting. Because while Washington was busy playing election year politics with Caracas, Moscow and Beijing were making moves that will have consequences for decades. Let me tell you what's really happening in Venezuela right now and why it should keep you up at night. The data doesn't support the idea that sanctions are an effective tool for regime change. If they were, we'd have seen results in Cuba, Iran, or North Korea by now. What the data does show is that sanctions create perverse incentives. They force targeted regimes to become more repressive, more corrupt, and more dependent on external patrons who don't care about human rights. In Venezuela's case, that patron has been Russia. And in the last 2 years, Moscow hasn't just been propping up Maduro, it's been turning Venezuela into a forward operating base for its ambitions in the Western Hemisphere. Let's start with the military dimension. In 2023, Russia deployed long-range bombers to Venezuela for the first time since the 2018 Tu-160 incident, when 2 nuclear-capable blackjack bombers landed in Caracas as a show of force. This time, it wasn't just a symbolic visit. According to U.S. Southern Command intelligence reports, Russia has been quietly extending its presence at Venezuela's La Orquilla Island, a strategic outpost in the Caribbean. Satellite imagery shows new construction consistent with a signals intelligence facility, one that could monitor U.S. naval movements in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. There are also reports of Russian technicians working on Venezuela's aging S-300 air defense systems, which, if upgraded, could pose a serious challenge to U.S. air superiority in the region. But the real game-changer isn't the military hardware, it's the energy deals. In 2023, Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil giant, signed a $16 billion agreement to develop Venezuela's offshore gas fields. That's not just an investment, it's a lifeline. With U.S. sanctions cutting off access to Western markets, Maduro has been forced to sell oil at a steep discount to China and India, often through shadowy middlemen who launder the transactions through shell commies. But Russia doesn't just buy Venezuelan oil, it helps sell it. Rosneft has been instrumental in helping Caracas evade U.S. sanctions, using a network of tankers and trading hubs to move Venezuelan crude to Asia. And here's the Russia isn't doing this out of the goodness of its heart. It's doing it because Venezuela's oil is the key to breaking the U.S. stranglehold on global energy markets. Then there's China. While Russia plays the military and energy card, Beijing is focused on the long turning Venezuela into a critical node in its global infrastructure network. In 2023, China's Exim Bank extended a $5 billion line of credit to Venezuela, money that will go toward modernizing ports, extending the electrical grid, and, most importantly, building a new deepwater port at Puerto Cabello. Why does that matter? Because Puerto Cabello is less than 1,500 miles from the AMA Canal, a choke point that the U.S. has controlled for over a century. If China can establish a major logistics hub in Venezuela, it gains a foothold in the Caribbean that could rival the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. And that's before we even get to the digital infrastructure. Huawei, which has been banned from U.S. networks, is now the dominant player in Venezuela's telecommunications sector. The Maduro regime has given the Comey unfettered access to build out 5G networks, surveillance systems, and even a new national ID database. If you think that's just about selling phones, you're not paying attention. Now, let me pause here because I know what some of you are. This is just Cold War 2.0. Russia and China are meddling in America's backyard, and we need to push back. And on the surface, that's true. But here's where the analysis gets more complicated and more dangerous. Because the US isn't just facing a resurgent Russia or an actionist China. It's facing the consequences of its own strategic overreach. Let's out for a moment. What we're seeing in Venezuela isn't just about one country, it's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order. For 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it could shape the world in its image. That it could promote democracy, enforce human rights, and maintain military dominance without consequence. That it could invade Iraq, overthrow Gaddafi, and sanction half the planet without creating blowback. But the world has changed. The unipolar moment is over. And Venezuela is the perfect case study in why America's grand strategy is failing. From a realist perspective, this was inevitable. Great powers don't accept permanent decline gracefully. Russia, humiliated by NATO action and the loss of its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, has spent the last decade pushing back wherever it can. China, meanwhile, has spent the last 20 years patiently building an alternative economic order, one that doesn't rely on the US dollar or Western financial institutions. And Latin America, long treated as America's backyard, is now the front line of this competition. The problem for the US is that it's trying to play a 21st century game with 20th century rules. The sanctions on Venezuela aren't just ineffective, they're counterproductive. They've pushed Maduro into the arms of Russia and China. They've given Moscow a foothold in the Caribbean. And they've handed Beijing a strategic beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. Worse, they've done all this while failing to achieve their stated regime change. If anything, the sanctions have made Maduro stronger. By cutting off Venezuela's access to Western markets, they've forced the country to become more self-sufficient and more dependent on its new patrons. And here's the US knows this. The intelligence community has been warning for years that sanctions often backfire. The Pentagon has quietly opposed some of the harshest measures, fearing they would push Venezuela closer to Russia. Even some in the State Department have argued for a more nuanced approach. But none of that matters, because in Washington, foreign policy isn't made by strategists, it's made by politicians. And politicians care about one winning the next election. Which brings me to the domestic political dimension of this crisis. Because if you want to understand why the US keeps making the same mistakes in Venezuela, you have to look at the incentives driving the decision makers in Washington. Let's start with Florida. No state has more influence over US policy toward Latin America than Florida. It's home to over 2.5 million Cuban Americans, 1.5 million Venezuelan Americans, and a growing number of Nicaraguan exiles, all of whom vote en bloc, and all of whom have a deep-seated distrust of leftist governments in the region. For decades, Florida's Cuban lobby has shaped U.S. policy toward Havana, pushing for a hardline stance that has done little to advance democracy but has kept the issue alive as a political cudgel. Now, the Venezuelan and Nicaraguan diasporas are playing the same game. And in a swing state where elections are decided by razor-thin margins, no politician, Democrat or Republican, can afford to ignore them. This is why you see such a disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality of U.S. policy toward Venezuela. On the one hand, the Biden administration has been quietly negotiating with Maduro, easing sanctions in exchange for concessions on migration and oil. On the other hand, it's under immense pressure from Florida politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, to take a harder line. The result is a policy that lurches between engagement and confrontation, with no clear endgame. And every time the administration tries to ease up, the opposition pounces. Just look at what happened in 2023, when Biden allowed Chevron to resume limited oil operations in Venezuela. The backlash from Florida was immediate. Senator Marco Rubio called it a betrayal. Governor Ron DeSantis accused Biden of selling out to a dictator. And within months, the administration was backtracking, reimposing sanctions under the guise of holding Maduro accountable. But here's the Florida isn't just a domestic political issue, it's a geopolitical one. Because the more the U.S. ties its Venezuela policy to the whims of Florida voters, the less flexibility it has to respond to the real strategic challenges posed by Russia and China. And the more it pushes Maduro into a corner, the more he's going to rely on Moscow and Beijing for survival. Then there's the role of the military-industrial complex. For years, the Pentagon has been sounding the alarm about Russia's growing presence in Latin America. In 2022, General Laura Richardson, the head of U.S. Southern Command, testified before Congress that Russia was extending its influence in our hemisphere and that Venezuela was a key node in that strategy. She warned that Moscow was using Venezuela as a platform to project power into the Caribbean and the Atlantic, threatening U.S. interests. But her warnings fell on deaf ears. Why? Because the U.S. military doesn't set policy, politicians do. And politicians are more concerned with scoring points in Florida than with crafting a coherent strategy for the region. This is the tragedy of U.S. policy toward it's not driven by grand strategy. It's driven by short-term political calculations. And in the process, the U.S. is ceding ground to its rivals without even realizing it. So where does this leave us? What happens next in Venezuela, and what does it mean for the broader competition between the US, Russia, and China? Let me walk you through the 3 most likely scenarios, ranked by probability. Scenario 1: the frozen conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela remains in a state of permanent crisis, neither fully collapsed nor fully stabilized. Maduro survives, but his regime remains isolated and dependent on Russia and China for survival. The US maintains sanctions, but they're porous enough to allow some oil to flow to Asia, keeping the regime afloat. The opposition remains divided, with no clear path to power. The economy continues to stagnate, but the government manages to avoid total collapse by printing money and relying on black market trade. This is the most likely outcome, because it's the one that requires the least effort from all sides. The US can claim it's holding the line against Maduro. Russia and China can continue to exploit Venezuela's resources without having to fully prop up the regime. And Maduro can stay in power without having to make any real concessions. The downside? This scenario locks Venezuela into a cycle of low-level instability, with periodic crises, migration surges, oil price shocks, and occasional military provocations from Russia that keep the region on edge. Scenario 2: the proxy war. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. In this version of events, the US decides that it can't afford to let Venezuela become a Russian-Chinese client state. It ramps up support for the opposition, providing weapons, training, and intelligence to anti-Maduro factions. Russia responds by doubling down on its military presence, deploying more advisors, air defense systems, and even Wagner Group mercenaries to protect its interests. China, meanwhile, uses its economic leverage to keep the regime afloat, while also hedging its bets by cultivating ties with the opposition. The result is a low-intensity proxy war, with Venezuela serving as the battleground for great power competition. The risk here is escalation. If the US or Russia miscalculates, if a US drone strike accidentally kills Russian advisors, or if a Russian missile downs a US surveillance plane, we could see a direct confrontation between the 2 nuclear powers. And unlike Ukraine, where NATO has a clear interest in deterring Russia, Venezuela is a gray zone. The US has no treaty obligations to defend it, and no clear exit strategy. This is how wars start, not with a bang, but with a series of missteps that spiral out of control. Scenario 3: the grand bargain. This is the least likely scenario, but it's the one that would actually serve US interests. In this version of events, the US recognizes that its current policy is failing and decides to cut a deal with Maduro. Not because it likes him, but because it has no other choice. The deal would look something like the US lifts sanctions in exchange for Maduro allowing free and fair elections, releasing political prisoners, and cutting ties with Russia and China. In return, the US would offer economic aid, debt relief, and a path to reintegration into the global financial system. The opposition would be given a role in the transition, but the US would accept that Maduro's party would likely remain a powerful force in Venezuelan politics. This is the scenario that realists have been advocating for years. It's messy, it's imperfect, and it would require the US to swallow its pride. But it's the only scenario that doesn't end in disaster. Now, let me be none of these scenarios. Now, what most people don't realize is that none of these scenarios exist in a vacuum. Venezuela isn't just a chess piece in some abstract great power game, it's a living, breathing crisis with real military and strategic implications that ripple far beyond its borders. And if we're being honest, the establishment narrative in Washington has been dangerously myopic about this. They treat Venezuela as a problem to be solved with sanctions and sternly worded statements, as if economic pressure alone can bend a regime that has spent the last 2 decades weaponizing survival. But let me explain why this matters in ways that most analysts gloss over. First, there's the military dimension. Venezuela's armed forces aren't just a domestic security apparatus, they're a geopolitical force multiplier for Russia and China. Since 2005, Venezuela has been the largest purchaser of Russian arms in Latin America, with deals totaling over $11 billion. We're talking Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets, T-72 tanks, S-300 air defense systems, and even the infamous Kalashnikov AK-103 rifles, which have become the backbone of the Venezuelan military. These aren't just weapons, they're a statement. When Maduro paraded those Su-30s in 2020, flying in formation over Caracas, it wasn't just for domestic propaganda. It was a message to the US, we have the hardware to make any intervention costly. And then there's the training. Russian military advisors have been embedded with Venezuelan forces since at least 2008, when Hugo Chavez signed a deal allowing Russian personnel to operate on Venezuelan soil. By 2019, U.S. Southern Command estimated that there were between 200 and 400 Russian military contractors in the country, including Wagner Group operatives. These aren't just advisors in the traditional sense, they're active participants in Venezuela's security architecture. They've helped set up electronic warfare systems, trained Venezuelan special forces, and even assisted in the development of a domestic drone program. In 2021, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned a Russian national, Yevgeny Shorokov, for allegedly helping Venezuela develop a kamikaze drone capability. That's not just a defensive measure, it's a tool for asymmetric warfare. Now, here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has been playing catch-up in this arena for years. While Washington was busy debating whether to recognize Juan Guaidó as president, Russia and China were quietly turning Venezuela into a forward operating base for their own strategic interests. The Chinese, for their part, have been more subtle but no less effective. They've provided surveillance technology, including facial recognition systems that have been used to crack down on dissent. They've also helped Venezuela develop a digital currency system, the Petro, which was ostensibly meant to bypass U.S. sanctions but has instead become a tool for regime survival. And let's not forget the Chinese-built satellite, the Venusat-1, which was launched in 2008 and has since been used for both civilian and military communications. But the real game-changer isn't just the hardware or the training, it's the doctrine. Venezuela has adopted what Russian military theorists call hybrid warfare, blending conventional military power with irregular tactics, cyber operations, and economic coercion. This isn't just about having tanks and fighter jets, it's about creating a system where the regime can survive even if the military fractures. Take the colectivos, for example, those armed civilian groups that act as the regime's enforcers. They're not just thugs, they're a deliberate part of Venezuela's security strategy, modeled after the Iranian Basij or the Syrian Shabiha. They allow the regime to outsource repression while maintaining plausible deniability. So what does this mean for U.S. policy? It means that any serious strategy for Venezuela can't just focus on sanctions or diplomacy. It has to account for the military reality on the ground. And that's where the establishment narrative falls apart. The U.S. has spent years treating Venezuela as a political problem, when in reality, it's a military problem with political dimensions. The regime isn't just corrupt, it's armed, and it's backed by two of the world's most formidable military powers. Let me give you an example. In 2020, the U.S. indicted Maduro and several of his top officials on drug trafficking charges, offering a $15 million bounty for his capture. It was a bold move, but it ignored the fact that Maduro's inner circle isn't just a criminal enterprise, it's a military one. The indictment named Diosdado Cabello, the head of the National Constituent Assembly, and Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, both of whom have deep ties to the armed forces. If the U.S. really wanted to pressure the regime, it would have to go after those ties, not just with sanctions, but with a credible military deterrent. And that's the problem. The U.S. has no credible military deterrent in Venezuela. The last time the U.S. seriously considered a military option was in 2019, when then National Security Advisor John Bolton hinted at a possible intervention. But the Pentagon quickly shot down the idea, and for good reason. Venezuela isn't Grenada in 1983. It's a country of 28 million people with a well-armed military, Russian air defenses, and a regime that has spent years preparing for asymmetric warfare. Any U.S. military action would be messy, costly, and politically toxic, especially in a region where anti-American sentiment runs deep. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a situation where the U.S. is stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, doing nothing allows Russia and China to entrench themselves further in the Western Hemisphere, turning Venezuela into a permanent thorn in Washington's side. On the other hand, any military action risks escalation with nuclear-armed powers, with no clear exit strategy. That's why the grand bargain scenario isn't just the least bad option, it's the only one that acknowledges the military reality of the situation. But here's the US can't negotiate from a position of weakness. If Washington wants to cut a deal with Maduro, it needs leverage. And right now, its only real leverage is economic. The problem is that sanctions alone haven't worked, because the regime has adapted. It's diversified its economy, deepened ties with Russia and China, and used the black market to survive. So if the US wants to force Maduro to the table, it needs to think beyond sanctions. It needs to think about how to disrupt Venezuela's military alliances, how to counter Russian and Chinese influence, and how to create a credible threat that doesn't involve boots on the ground. That's where things get complicated. Because the truth is, the US has been outmaneuvered in Venezuela. Russia and China have played a long game, turning the country into a strategic asset while Washington was distracted by other crises. And now, the US is left with either accept that Venezuela is a lost cause, or try to regain the initiative with a strategy that actually accounts for the military and geopolitical realities on the ground. The establishment won't like this, because it means admitting that the last 2 decades of US policy in Venezuela have failed. But that's the reality. And if we don't start facing it, we're going to wake up one day to find that Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a Russian and Chinese military outpost in America's backyard. And by then, it'll be too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a story about great powers jockeying for influence in Caracas. It's also a story about the internal fractures within Venezuela itself, fractures that have been papered over by years of authoritarian rule, economic collapse, and now, geopolitical brinkmanship. The establishment narrative in Washington likes to treat Venezuela as a monolith, a country where Maduro's regime is either all-powerful or on the verge of collapse, depending on which think tank you listen to. But the reality is far messier, and understanding those domestic dynamics is just as critical as tracking Russian fighter jets or Chinese oil deals. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's survival isn't just about external support from Moscow or Beijing, though that's certainly part of it. It's also about the fact that his regime has, over the past decade, hollowed out Venezuela's institutions to the point where they're barely functional, but still just coherent enough to keep the opposition fragmented and the military loyal. Take the National Assembly, for instance. The 2015 elections gave the opposition a 2/3 supermajority, a historic victory that should have been a turning point. Instead, Maduro's Supreme Court, packed with loyalists, stripped the legislature of its powers, and by 2020, the regime had installed a parallel assembly stacked with Chavista allies. The opposition's response? A series of failed strategies, from Juan Guaido's self-declaration as interim president in 2019 to the botched Operation Gideon in 2020, where a ragtag group of mercenaries tried to invade the country and overthrow Maduro. Each time, the opposition has miscalculated, either overestimating its own strength or underestimating the regime's resilience. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime isn't just propped up by foreign patrons. It's also held together by a system of patronage, repression, and sheer inertia that has made it nearly impossible for the opposition to mount a credible challenge. The military, for example, isn't just a monolithic bloc. It's a network of factions, some loyal to Maduro, others to Diosdado Cabello, the powerful head of the Constituent Assembly, and still others to figures like Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister. The regime has kept these factions in check through a combination of corruption. Officers control lucrative smuggling routes, gold mines, and even drug trafficking, and the threat of purges. In 2018, Maduro arrested over 100 military officers on charges of treason, a move that sent a clear dissent will not be tolerated. But here's where it gets interesting. The same system that keeps Maduro in power is also the one that's slowly eroding his legitimacy. The economy is a shell of what it once was. Hyperinflation, which peaked at over 1,000,000% in 2018, has stabilized at a still catastrophic 200% in 2023, according to the IMF. Oil production, which once made Venezuela the richest country in Latin America, has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. The black market has become the real economy, with the bolivar so worthless that many Venezuelans have abandoned it entirely in favor of the US dollar. And yet, despite all this, Maduro has managed to avoid a total implosion. How? By allowing a degree of economic liberalization, what some analysts call authoritarian capitalism, where the regime turns a blind eye to private sector activity as long as it doesn't challenge its political control. This is the paradox of Venezuela today. The country is both a failed state and a functioning kleptocracy. It's a place where the government can't provide basic services, water, electricity, healthcare, but where the military and connected elites still profit from the chaos. And that's what makes the domestic political situation so volatile. On one hand, Maduro's grip on power is stronger than it's been in years. The opposition is divided, the economy is dollarized enough to prevent a total collapse, and the regime has successfully neutralized the most serious threats to its rule. On the other hand, the underlying conditions that could spark a crisis, massive inequality, a disillusioned population, and a military that's increasingly dependent on foreign support, haven't gone away. So what does this mean for the future? Let's game out a few scenarios. The first, and most likely in the short term, is what I'd call managed decline. In this scenario, Maduro continues to rule through a combination of repression, economic liberalization, and foreign patronage. The regime allows just enough economic activity to keep the population from revolting, while cracking down on any organized opposition. The US and its allies might ease some sanctions in exchange for cosmetic reforms, like allowing limited international observation of elections, but Maduro remains in power. This is essentially the status quo, and it's the path of least resistance for everyone involved. The regime gets to stay in power, Russia and China maintain their influence, and the US avoids a messy confrontation. The second scenario is what I'd call controlled transition. This is where things get interesting. In this scenario, the US and its allies, along with key regional players like Brazil and Colombia, push for a negotiated transition that preserves some elements of Chavismo while allowing for a return to democratic governance. This could involve a power-sharing agreement, early elections with international oversight, or even a truth and reconciliation process to address the regime's crimes. The problem, of course, is that Maduro has no incentive to agree to this unless he's given ironclad guarantees like immunity from prosecution or a role in a post-transition government. And even then, the military and hardline Chavistas might resist, leading to a split within the regime. The third scenario is the one no one wants to talk collapse. This could happen in a few ways. One possibility is that the regime's economic liberalization backfires, leading to a resurgence of hyperinflation or a run on the dollar. Another is that the military fractures, with factions turning on each other in a bid for control. Or, perhaps most dangerously, the regime could overplay its hand, cracking down too hard on protests, for example, and sparking a popular uprising that it can't contain. In this scenario, Venezuela could descend into a full-blown civil conflict, with regional powers like Brazil and Colombia drawn in, and the US forced to decide whether to intervene. Now, here's where the geopolitical and domestic dimensions intersect. The US has a vested interest in avoiding the collapse scenario, because it would almost certainly lead to a humanitarian crisis on a scale not seen in the Western Hemisphere since the 1980s. But it also has an interest in preventing the managed decline scenario from becoming permanent, because that would mean ceding Venezuela to Russia and China indefinitely. The only way out of this dilemma is to push for the controlled transition scenario, but that requires leverage, and as I've argued before, the US doesn't have much of it right now. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a situation where the US needs to rethink its approach to Venezuela, not just in terms of sanctions or military threats, but in terms of how it engages with the country's domestic political actors. The opposition, for all its flaws, is still the only viable alternative to Maduro. But it's also deeply divided, with factions ranging from hardline anti-Chavistas to more pragmatic figures willing to negotiate with the regime. The US needs to figure out how to unify these factions, or at least get them to agree on a common strategy. It also needs to think about how to peel away elements of the regime like the military or the business elite who might be willing to defect if given the right incentives. This is where things get really tricky. Because the truth is, the US has been burned before by its attempts to shape Venezuela's internal politics. The 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, which the US tacitly supported, failed spectacularly and left Washington looking like an imperialist meddler. The 2019 push to recognize Guaidó as interim president was a bold move, but it ultimately fizzled out, leaving the opposition weaker than before. And the 2020 mercenary fiasco was a disaster that played right into Maduro's hands. So if the US wants to regain the initiative, it needs to be smarter this time. It needs to work with regional partners, avoid overpromising, and focus on building a broad coalition that includes not just the opposition but also civil society groups, business leaders, and even disaffected Chavistas. Let me be, this isn't about regime change. It's about creating the conditions for a negotiated transition, one that preserves Venezuela's sovereignty, avoids a civil war, and gives the country a chance to rebuild. But to get there, the US needs to accept a few hard truths. The first is that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon. The second is that the opposition, as currently constituted, isn't strong enough to force him out. And the third is that any solution will require concessions from both the US and the regime that neither side is currently willing to make. This is the reality of Venezuela in 2024. It's a country that's been broken by 2 decades of misrule, but it's also a country that's still standing, defiant and unpredictable. The question is whether the US and its allies can find a way to engage with that reality, or whether they'll continue to be outmaneuvered by a regime that's proven far more resilient than anyone expected. One thing's for the decisions made in the next few years will determine not just Venezuela's future, but the geopolitical balance of the entire Western Hemisphere. And if we don't get this right, we'll be dealing with the consequences for decades to come.